think that we're good to go. So hi everybody, and welcome for the first seminar of the term. We have Andrea Giuliani today as our speaker from ETH, and Yaakov will present him. Take it away.
So I have to say that it's a pleasure to present today a good friend of mine for a few years already. And when I looked for your CV, Andrea, last night to say a few things about you, actually I was quite stunned, you know. And I would say that you are one of the leading scientists, young scientists that I know. Andrea started his studies, bachelor and master's in Italy. Then he moved to the University of Melbourne. He did there his PhD and also his postdocs. He stayed there as a lecturer. And since 2019, he's in ETH. And during this time in Melbourne and in ETH, he got some really prestige awards like Marie Curie Fellow, the DECRA Award in Australia, and the Swiss Ambitionist. This is how you pronounce it, Andrea?
Ambizione.
Ambizione. Okay. He had 16 students until now. And what I saw, which was quite unbelievable, and this is why I'm saying that Andrea is one of the leading scientists, especially in his fields. He has about 70 published manuscripts already. Quite amazing. Okay. And I'm not going to give you any more compliments. I think I gave you enough.
Yes.
Take it from here.
Thank you, Yaakov. Yeah, I'm flattered. Yeah, that was too much. No, well, thanks for inviting me. Really, it's great to present some of the things that we've been doing. I've been doing together with quite a few people over the last few years. So today I'm gonna present you a paper that was actually just in press last Friday in Science Advances. The title of the talk is the same title as the paper. Yet the talk will first will be for about half of it. Will provide you an overview of what kimberlites are, where they come from, and some of the novelty about kimberlites related to studies of the last few years, and that will provide a sort of background to then lead the discussion into what kimberlites tell us about the evolution of the global carbon cycle. So the reason why many of you might know kimberlites is because these are the deepest. These are the major host rocks for diamonds. And then here are quite a few nice pictures. These ones actually taken by myself, looking at the personal diamond collection of John Gurney. You know, I'm used to tell that carbon is just a piece of carbon that has been very well advertised and marketed by De Beers over the years. But actually, I must admit that, you know, when I was sitting in front of piles of diamonds, such as in this the diamond separation plant here in Kimberley, or looking at the personal collection of John Gurney down here, I mean, guys, it's actually quite amazing, I have to say. Those gems really have something peculiar. Oh, I hope, by the way, you can see my my cursor. Can you? Otherwise, I might have to. Okay. Can you see my cursor? Can you see my?
Yeah, we can see it fine.
Oh, can you see that or not?
All is good, Andrea.
Oh, okay, great. No, because sometimes I point to things, but maybe I just wanted to make sure you could actually see that. Anyway, but the other reason why we're particularly interested in these magmatic rocks is because they are produced by the deepest melts we find at surface. And the reason is simple. These are really the only magmas that contain the so-called super deep diamonds. So diamonds with inclusions that are stable in the convective mantle, or even as far down as the mantle transition zone. Also, kimberlites occur essentially on every continent of Earth. In this map, the salmon-colored domains are continental shields, so the old continental nuclei. The red symbols are kimberlites, and the yellow one are kimberlites that are or have been mined for diamonds. Some kimberlites have also been reported for Antarctica. Actually, they're not kimberlites. I have those samples, and so this is why they're not plotted there. The other interesting facts of kimberlites is that by looking at them, we can actually look at magmatism through a good chunk of the evolution of the Earth, as far back as at least 2.1 billion years. There are a few reports of kimberlites that are a little bit older, 2.5, 2.8. I've looked at a couple of samples from here, from this 2.8 locality. Those are not kimberlites. So, the literature tells us a lot of things, but often if you don't look at things with our own eyes, then we might be fooled. So yeah, kimberlites are, the major host rocks of diamonds. That's true, but a fact that is commonly not widely known is that diamonds occur at the sub-part per million level, and most kimberlites actually don't have any diamonds. Few of them, though, have big stones, such as the Letseni Leroda, something like that. I might have spelled it wrong. This is the second largest stone ever recovered and come from exactly this mine, Karowe, which we had the pleasure to visit a few years ago. This is 1100 carats, so we're talking about 300 grams of diamond. Was sold for about 53 million in the diamond market. The other thing that you have to be aware when we talk about kimberlites is that these are very complex rocks. Okay, they consist of crustal fragments, they consist of mantle fragments, including the odd diamond, if you're lucky enough, in a matrix that is very complex too. If I have to summarize the petrogenesis, the mineralogy of kimberlites, the makeup of kimberlites, using just very few words, I would say that they fundamentally include a lot of olivine, especially the fresh ones, where olivine is here the colorless mineral, and often they are really enriched in carbonates, which here is the white mineral in this kimberlite breccia. The carbon enrichment of kimberlites is, of course, a key feature of this talk, and I will come back to that a little bit later. So while over the years there's been a lot of debate as to where kimberlites come from, and there is still, I think that's what I now can present a little bit as a fact: the origin of kimberlites from somewhere in the convective mantle. The debate is still fierce out there, or let's say within our community. And so now I'm going to bring you some piece of information as to why I think the source of kimberlites can be, at least in some cases, quite deep. So this chart has 4 different options, which I'm not going to discuss in any detail over here. I have a couple of extra slides at the end for those of you who might be a little bit more interested. So now I will just provide you some piece of information, though, and then you can potentially make up your mind. So we know that kimberlites host so-called super deep diamonds. Okay, those diamonds have inclusions of mineral like ringwoodite or calcium silica perovskites, even though, funny enough, there are 2 papers, one in Nature, one in Science, showing the presence of calcium silica perovskite, a mineral that is stable, in the mantle transition zone, uppermost, lower mantle, even deeper. And both these papers are actually have been questioned. The usual stories, I guess. Anyway, the finding of ringwoodite has never really been disputed. So we know that some of these diamonds come from as deep as at least the mantle transition zone. That doesn't necessarily mean the kimberlites are that deep. But what I'm doing here, those diamonds might also have been transported to the uppermost astenosphere before being entrained. The only thing that for sure they tell us is that the kimberlites must come from at least those depths. This is a little bit more of a complicated story than I'm going to tell you just in a couple of words. There is a direct correlation between the composition of xenocrystic olivine and the composition of magmatic olivine in kimberlites. In other words, there is a correlation between the composition of the mantle that is entrained and assimilated and the composition of the kimberlite melt. For this linear correlation to occur, we need to start from a common melt composition, and therefore we need the source in terms of measure elements, the source of kimberlites globally, to be broadly similar. Then by assimilating more or less refractory material, we just move up or down this curve. In other words, the major element chemistry of kimberlites, and particularly of olivine, is telling us that the source of kimberlites does not vary so much globally in terms of major elements. And being the lithospheric mantle a very heterogeneous environment, that tends to exclude the lithospheric mantle as the source of these magmas. Then we have also pieces of evidence coming from geodynamic reconstructions and geophysics and geochronology that puts the source of several kimberlites below the lithosphere. So this is a quite famous paper by Trond Torsvik from 2010, where he showed that when we moved the position of kimberlites back in time at the time of their eruption, the vast majority of Phanerozoic kimberlites, which are here reported with black dots, overlap the margins or overall the location of the so-called large low shear velocity provinces, or LLSVPs. These are thermochemical structures located above the core mantle boundary, which are imaged by seismic tomography, and that represent the generation zones of mantle plumes, which today feed oceanal basalts, or in the past have fed continental large igneous provinces. So potentially there is a link between plumes from the core mantle boundary, not strong ones, of course, and several kimberlites. This relationship is reinforced in some localities where, such as here, we are in Eastern North America. And what you can see is that there is an age progressive corridor with a bunch of kimberlites that become progressively younger going into the North Atlantic Ocean. Then this progression is followed by the New England seamounts and so more common OIBs. Potentially the link between hotspot tracks and kimberlites suggests that also a more direct link between kimberlites and plumes from the subcontinental lithospheric mantle, as well as, from below the subcontinental lithospheric mantle, as well as a link with oceanal basalts. A link with oceanal basalts that is indeed reinforced when we compare the isotopic composition of kimberlites and OIBs and oceanal basalts. This is a compilation from a few years ago, hafnium isotopes on the y-axis, neodymium isotopes on the x-axis. Colorful symbols are kimberlites, light gray symbols are oceanal basalts. If we remove this tail of oceanal basalts that feature high neodymium and hafnium isotopic compositions, which these are places like Iceland or Galapagos, where there is influence by ridge processing, so by depleted upper mantle material. So once we remove this tail, then essentially there is a very nice overlap between the composition of kimberlites and OIBs. And this comparison can actually be extended further to strontium isotopes, as I've done recently, which is, however, not shown here. So the source is potentially deep, is similar to the one on ocean island basalts. And according to this paper that we put out a couple of years ago, it's potentially also quite ancient. So the chart that is most relevant here is this one, is the chart of time versus neodymium isotopes of kimberlites through time. And the observation is that there is a very little spread in the neodymium isotopic compositions of kimberlites at any given time. And furthermore, all the compositions tend to plot along essentially the same regression. So this was employed by my colleagues and myself to propose that the source of kimberlites is the same over time, except for the last few 100 million years, and it was relatively closed, relatively shielded from mantle convection, and therefore was isolated from exchange with other reservoir through time. And just note that here we go from about 2 billion years to nearly present day. So in this more recent paper, I decided to explore the topic in a little bit more detail. I went with Matt Jackson and a couple of colleagues from the Kimberlites and Diamond Research Group. We went through the literature once more. We pulled out many more data than those that were included in the previous slide, and we realized that actually at any given time there is indeed quite a spread. Not everywhere, but at many localities there is quite a spread in neodymium isotopes. This is actually the same chart that I showed you before. So this spread towards lower neodymium isotopic composition at any given time can be related to crustal contamination, recycling of enriched material in the deep mantle, interaction with the lithospheric mantle, to a number of processes. So what we decided to do was just to isolate the most depleted component in every kimberlite province, which is now indicated here with this cross. So essentially, we decided just to restrict our view to screen out every other possible influence and just focus on the depleted component in each kimberlite province, where each kimberlite province is indicated by a different symbol and color. If you do that, then you end up with a regression that is now extremely narrow and linear, of course, and extremely narrow in terms of spreading, which I define as the depleted kimberlite source. Interestingly enough, this is intermediate in composition between CHER, the composition of the bulk silicate third, and the depleted mantle source, so say the source of MORBs today. What then we decided to do to understand the origin of this source, we decided to do something bold and to some extent speculative, I have to say. So we traced this regression back to something like the age of the Earth or thereabouts. If we do that, then essentially we end up that at about 4.5 billion years, the composition of this depleted kimberlite source is actually the same as CHER, where CHER is simply the average of chondritic meteorites. In other words, is the same composition of the bulk silicate Earth. What this might indicate is that this source is very ancient and derives from an early depletion, so early differentiation of the bulk silicate Earth, a time when the samarium-neodymium ratio was fractionated and therefore the two curves, the CHER curves and the depleted kimberlite source curve started to depart from each other. It's I guess, an interesting idea that then of course we decided to explore further. But what is today this depleted kimberlite source? So what is today what does it represent, this yellow star up here? To figure that out, we compared that composition of the depleted kimberlite source with this global compilation of ocean island basalts. These are hafnium versus neodymium and neodymium versus strontium isotopes from the compilation of Andrea Stracke. So there in the center, you can see the so-called PRIMA, prevalent mantle component, or focal zone. What is PRIMA? PRIMA was originally defined as the most frequent composition of ocean island basalts in a distribution, in a frequency diagram of neodymium isotopes. This is, you can see the chart looks a bit fuzzy because this is taken from the original paper of Zindler and Hart in 1986. However, PRIMA also corresponds to FOS, or the focal zone. This is the area, the region where the compositional trends formed by different chains of ocean islands actually converge. So this seems to be a common component in ocean island basalts. And I guess you can probably gather where I'm going with this. That's also what the depleted kimberlite source actually represents. So in other words, this depleted component that we find in kimberlites is nothing different than PRIMA. Prima is a fundamental component of the Earth mantle, and in recent years has been defined as essentially a product of plate tectonics, mixing of depleted mantle components and enriched mantle components, say recycled oceanic crust material. However, if Prima has been existing and has been sampled by kimbalites over more than 2 billion years, it is unlikely that this can be just a product of plate tectonics, simply because, for example, the composition of recycled crustal material has changed continuously through time. So in other words, we're going back to an origin of Prima as a very ancient component of the Earth mantle. To further explore this theme with Richard Walker and his postdoc Nao Nakanishi, we decided to look at tungsten isotopes in kimbalites, and especially at tungsten 182. This isotopic system, the hafnium-tungsten isotopic system, is quite powerful fundamentally for two reasons. First of all, it's tungsten 182 is a short-lived isotope with an half-life of only 9 million years. In other words, hafnium 182 went extinct within 50 to 60 million years within 60 million years of Earth accretion. And if we find some variability in tungsten 182 in kimbalites compared to the terrestrial standard, so which is here indicating as 0, that might mean that we're actually looking at a very ancient source, a source that's differentiated from the rest of the bulk silicate mantle within 50 million years of Earth accretion. In alternative, large differences can also be related to interaction between this source and the mantle, which has and the core, sorry, which has a very low tungsten 182 isotopic composition. I guess interestingly enough, we did find a quite small variation for the average of these kimbalites and compared to the standard, the laboratory standard, which is considered to be representative of the bulk silicate Earth, even though I have to say new analysis of MORBS seems to show that these values actually a little bit displayed to the right here. Two younger kimbalites that show a strongly geochemical enriched isotopic signature don't show this 182 tungsten isotopic anomaly. So how do we explain this negative value? So either we are looking at an early differentiated source, so a very ancient source of kimbalites, or we are looking at some contribution from the core and therefore to a very deep source of kimbalites, or perhaps there might have been a little bit of late accreted material, which also features very low tungsten 182 composition that did not get homogenized with the rest of the mantle and now is still preserved in the source of kimbalites. So either way, the source of kimbalites based on tungsten 182 is either very deep or quite ancient or both. Okay, so this is sort of initial first broad introduction into kimbalites and especially into some of the new things that we've put forward in the last few years about these interesting rocks. I believe there is quite good evidence for a remarkably similar source in terms of major elements that puts remarkably similar major element composition from the primary kimbalite melt, which put the source of these magmas somewhere in the sublithospheric mantle. The source of kimbalites hosts an ancient component, at least older than 2.5 billion years, which seems to be common to most kimbalite provinces worldwide. The source based on, for example, 182 tungsten and some of the evidence from geophysics and geodynamics seems to be very deep. However, keep in mind one thing. I'm here, of course, simplifying things as much as possible to present them into a compact seminar. We actually see a lot of variability in kimbalites worldwide. There is a lot of influences by different processes that I'm not tackling here directly. So keep that in mind also for the remaining of the talk, which is indeed about the carbon cycle and specifically what kimbalites can tell us about the global carbon cycle. So this is a slide that I borrowed from, a cartoon that I borrowed from the conclusive report of the Deep Carbon Observatory from 2019. It's simply a nice schematic representation of the global carbon cycle, where each domain, depending on the size, on its size in terms of carbon content, is displayed as a circle, and where all the fluxes are represented as blue arrows. I'm pretty sure you're quite familiar with it, and as you probably know, most of these fluxes and many of these reservoirs are actually quite well constrained today. Of course, there are still major uncertainties, for example, on the amount of carbon that is released from the lithosphere or during rifting, and so there is definitely more work to do over there. But I guess the question that I here want to target using kimberlites, and where I think we are still quite in the dark, is how these fluxes have changed in the past. In other words, how has the deep carbon cycle changed in the past? And because kimberlites are carbon rich and provide us a good record of the last 2 or so billion years, then perhaps we can use them to say something meaningful about the variability in the global carbon cycle through time. So the tool that I'm going to use is carbon isotopes, and the reason is simple. There are large variability in isotopic composition of carbon that is stored at the surface, or in general in the crust, and carbon that is stored in the mantle. If you look at the surface first, this is a chart of time versus carbon 13 over carbon 12, normalized to a terrestrial standard, so to PdB in this case, and expressed as delta 13 carbon. What you can see is that carbon, oxidized carbon, say limestone or carbon in shells, doesn't vary. Of course, it shows some fluctuations over time, but is generally restricted to around 0, or plus 1, plus minus 2 per mil. If we now look at organic carbon, the composition is quite different. Again, there are fluctuations through time, but we're generally looking at values that are confined to between -25 and -30. So very different from oxidized carbon up here. If we now turn to the mantle, and specifically, we find completely different values. So the main mode of carbon in diamonds, for example, is -5, plus minus 1. This is quite clear for peridotitic diamonds, so diamonds with inclusions of typical mantle mineral, but it's also the case for eclogitic diamonds, so diamonds with inclusions of garnet and omphacites. Just a word then on oceanic basalts, you can see that the main mode here is shifted to somewhat lower values. This is due essentially to the gassing, a process that lower carbon isotopes. And the main reason is that basalts have a very low solubility of carbon, and therefore most of the carbon was actually released before crystallization. Hence this shift over here. There is another important information though for eclogitic diamonds, something that unfortunately often goes overlooked in the literature outside the diamond community. So there is a long tail towards a very light carbon isotopic composition, which most authors usually attribute to recycling of organic carbon. That's fair enough. The interesting observation is that there are very, very few analyses, and just from a couple of localities, of oxidized carbons or heavy carbon isotopes due to oxidized, subducted, or deeply recycled oxidized carbon. Yet, if you read a lot of the recent literature, say on metastable isotopes in mantle-derived magmas, you see so much emphasis on deep subduction and recycling of limestone and oxidized carbon, for which, for example, in the diamonds, there is very little, if any, evidence. And that is something else that I think we should keep in mind. Anyway, before going into the carbon isotopes of kimberlites globally, I have a slide to essentially explain you how this project unfolded. So we didn't go globally immediately. We didn't just crushed like 150 or 200 samples and measure them, but we first tried to figure out where carbon sits and what carbon isotopes mean in a bunch of selected kimberlites by in situ means. So we did detailed petrography, and we confirmed something we previously know, that is, carbon in kimberlites occur in carbonates, but there are different textural generations. We have calcite segregations like globules of carbonates. We have interstitial groundmass, interstitial calcite or dolomite, and both of these are generally magmatic. But we also have veins of calcite which cut across the texture of kimberlites, and these are clearly secondary. Okay, these form when the rock was already solid after magma crystallization. Then we went in situ, we did microprobe analysis, we did analysis of trace elements of strontium isotopes, but also analysis of carbon isotopes by SIMS, by secondary ion mass spectrometry. And we found quite a bit of variability within each of the 10 or so samples we investigated. So that's, the first sight was a bit discouraging, especially if you want to go globally and if you want to try a quicker method such as bulk rock analysis. However, when we plotted the average of in situ analysis of magmatic carbonate only and compared that with bulk sample analysis, we found that the majority of samples actually plotted along this one-to-one line. And these are one standard deviations, these horizontal bars. In other words, except for a couple of outliers, all the other analyses all the bulk sample analyses are within uncertainty of the average of the in situ analysis of magmatic carbonate only. So these veins are not included in these averages, meaning that we can just crush a kimberlite and 90% of cases, if not more, we're actually going to get a pristine carbon isotopic signature for the magmatic carbonate. So armed with this knowledge, then, as I said before, we went globally. We analyzed something like 150 samples and undertook more than 200 analyses, including duplicates and some triplicates. The compilation, as you can see, is really global. We go from Australia to North America to Brazil, South Africa, Russia, and so on. And we also included previously published data from the literature. Oh, the other thing I have to say, here we are only looking at subvolcanic kimberlites, no pyroclastic rocks, no volcanoclastic rocks, no samples that were hydrothermally altered or went through massive subaerial degassing. Those are not included in this compilation. So these are the data, time versus carbon isotopes. The green band is the mantle range. What you can see is that up to about 250 million years or so, except for 2 localities from Finland, all the other localities plot squarely or within uncertainty within the mantle range. So the carbon that kimberlites brought up to the surface up to this point was dominantly very normal, boring mantle-derived carbon, primordial carbon, if you prefer. And keep in mind, sorry, that each symbol is the average of at least 3 analyses from at least 2 samples, even though most of these symbols are actually averages of many, many more analyses. What we see after 250 million years is something quite different than what we can observe before. More than 1/3 of the analyses over there are outside the 1 sigma analytic uncertainty of the mantle range. And the overall distribution of these analyses is actually skewed towards lighter isotopic composition, so lower delta 13 values. There's a clear perturbation in the carbon isotopic composition of kimberlites after this point. This is what the data show us. The interesting observation is that this perturbation in carbon isotopes is actually paralleled also by radiogenic isotopes. Here I'm showing you strontium isotopes, where you can see that while there is always some variability at any given time, when we go past 250 million years, we start to see very radiogenic isotopic composition. Okay, and as this little chart try to summarize, essentially this is related to more geochemical enrichment of the source of these kimbolites. So that then we can compare the strontium isotopes of kimbolite versus the carbon isotopes, and strontium here is only for perovskite, a magmatic ground mass phase in kimbolites. We're not looking at bulk rocks where strontium could be compromised by secondary processes. Here instead we're looking at hafnium isotopes versus carbon isotopes. In both cases, we find some correlation. The correlations are not robust. We are looking at R-square values that are not particularly high. However, they are statistically significant by means of, student t-test and the like. Observing this correlation is actually important for fundamentally two reasons. First reason, strontium and hafnium isotopes are not affected by the gassing. Carbon isotopes can be affected by the gassing. And as I showed you before for basalts, a way to decrease carbon isotopes is indeed the gassing. However, that process should not have any effects on strontium and hafnium isotopes. And therefore, if these parameters are correlated, that we're not looking at the degassing signature. We are looking actually at the source signature. Also, increasing strontium and decreasing hafnium isotopes, they point towards geochemical enrichment of the source by deeply subducted recycled material. And therefore, the fact that carbon isotopes decrease with strontium, with increasing strontium, and decrease with decreasing hafnium requires that these lower carbon isotopic compositions are due to deep cycling of recycled material. In other words, deep cycling of organic carbon in the deep earth. I really could not find any other explanation for these data. So now we know the origin of this signature, or at least we believe we know the origin of this signature, assuming you agree with me, but we don't know what's the trigger. And this is what the last slide is, where I'm going, what I'll try to address in this conclusive, in this last slide. So the chart up here is again carbon isotopes versus time. Now we're only looking at the last billion years. Here I'm showing you something slightly different. The number of kimbolite events during the last billion years. And the interesting observation is that when we start to see a higher frequency of kimbolite eruptions, then it's also when we start to see a perturbation in the carbon, as well as the strontium, neodymium, and hafnium isotopic composition of kimbolites. Down here, there is something that is apparently completely unrelated. This is the total organic carbon in shales. In other words, the total organic carbon deposited in marine sediments. What you see here is that after the Cambrian explosion at around 440 something million years ago, 41, 42, there is a manifold increase in the amount of organic carbon that is deposited in marine sediments, which is just a consequence of the increased primary productivity in the oceans following the explosion, the radiation of multicellular life. So, yet, of course, what I'm trying to put, the idea that I'm trying to push here is that we have an increase in the total organic carbon that is deposited in marine sediments. And after that, we have, of course, subduction of these marine sediments and therefore transport of organic carbon deep in the earth. Yet there is something like a 300 or so million years lag between these events and the perturbation of the carbon in the carbon isotopic composition of kimbolites. This is where geodynamics, I guess, come handy. This is a chart this is a cartoon that I borrowed from a recent chapter by Trond Torsvik, which shows that it takes about 150 to 200 million years for a subducted slab to travel all the way down to the core mantle boundary. Then it takes another 20, 30 or so, at least, million years to travel along the core mantle boundary and finally to impinge into large low shear velocity provinces. And finally, it takes another 20 or 30 million years at least to be transported upward in mantle plumes. So the whole cycle takes between 250 to 300 million years, which perhaps just coincidentally is indeed the time lag, the minimum time lag that we observe between the Cambrian explosion and this increase in kimberlite events, or this, in general, this perturbation in the deep carbon cycle signaled by kimberlites. Of course, this was only possible because a few million years later, that's when we start also to have a colder subduction regime, and therefore subduction was deeper, and sedimentary material, or in general shallow material, volatile shallow material could be, volatile bearing shallow material could be more efficiently subducted deep in the earth. So overall, the idea that I'm pushing here is that we have the perturbation that we see in the shallow carbon cycle might be very well linked to a perturbation that we see in the deep carbon cycle, and specifically in the geochemistry and frequency of kimberlite events. So to sum up, the observation is that there is a clear perturbation in the carbon as well as strontium, neodymium, and hafnium isotopic composition of kimberlites after 250 million years ago. The way I try to explain it, at least for carbon, is by linking surface process, shallow processes, and especially an increase in marine biosphere productivity and a colder subduction regime with a related change in the sedimentary input in the mantle, and therefore a perturbation of some domains of the deep earth, and of course not the whole mantle. Ultimately, the overall idea that I'm proposing is that the processes that occur at the surface, so biogeochemical changes that we see at the surface, might actually have an influence on the deep earth, a previously overlooked influence on the deep earth. So it is really a two-way system that we should consider here. Moving forward, of course, we need to find less equivocal tracers that kimberlites truly derive from the very deep earth. And for example, right now I'm working with noble gases to try to figure that out, to figure out whether there is really an ancient or primordial component in kimberlites or not, and whether or not they are as deep as we think. We need to better link. We need to find ultimately new tools to link changes occurring at the surface, for example, changes in the oxidation state of the oceans, or again related to explosions of multicellular life, and the composition of the mantle, and not by studying just kimberlites, but of course we need to expand further and go into more widespread mafic magma compositions, and probably explore new isotopic tracers, for example. This is a little bit of a testament of my ongoing research program, if you want. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Andrea, for an awesome talk. I really enjoyed it. Questions? Let's take some questions. I see that Itaya Levi is both clapping and raising his hand. Go ahead.
Which is hard to do physically, but easy to do virtually. So thanks for this very interesting talk, Andrea. And I mean, these are really compelling data sets, and I wanted to ask something and maybe comment on the interpretation of the influence of the Cambrian explosion. So you're invoking a change or an increase in the primary productivity, but what I wanted to point out is that primary productivity is ultimately limited on these timescales by the delivery of the limiting nutrient, which on these timescales is phosphate. So the question is there? I mean, multicellularity itself won't necessarily do it. It might, and basically what we're seeing in the Cambrian explosion is an increase in the diversity of organisms that live in relatively shallow marine environments and get preserved in the record, right? So, you know, this increase in TOC in shales could just be a shift in the location where organisms you know, live and preserve organic matter, and that might actually lead to a decrease in the subduction of organic carbon. So what I wanted to ask was, is there independent evidence for a change in supply rates of the limiting nutrients, and specifically phosphate? And then what I wanted to also offer as food for thought is that, given the time lag of 200, 300 million years from onset of deeper of deeper subduction, there's another event that's thought to have occurred around that time, which is an increase in the rates of seafloor spreading and plate tectonics in response to decreasing mantle temperatures, mantle potential temperature, right? So with higher early heat production, you have a lower mantle viscosity and a lesser coupling between the, mantle convection and plate motion. Which is thought, Jun Korinaga has been promoting these ideas that you essentially have slower seafloor spreading and sluggish plate tectonics, and that the coupling increased as the mantle cooled, and that this occurred sometime in the Neoproterozoic. So around the right time, with that lag that you mentioned in the last slide, to actually result in the deeper subduction, so that maybe the reason for this is not a greater productivity and more organic carbon burial, right, which requires more nutrients, but actually a change in the tectonic regime and the depth of subduction.
Yes, looks about your second comment, surely that has to be part of the explanation, or I mean, it has to be, of course, has to be part of the explanation, simply because if we didn't have colder subduction regimes, which are the same, essentially are the same thing that you're referring to, so lower mantle potential temperature, that is what is leading to deeper subduction, deeper slab break-off, and therefore better transports in very coarse language of subducting material to the deep mantle. That is a necessary requirement, at least to my mind. Regarding your first question, the short answer is that I don't know. I am aware of an increase in phosphorus in marine sediments, both in the form of phosphorites, but also take the phosphorus iron ratio in Neoproterozoic seawaters, which seems to confirm that indeed since I think 700 or 800 million years ago, we start to have a progressive increase in marine productivity. I've been a mantle geochemist. I can only really scratch the surface of this topic, and the little reading that I've done on the topic seems to confirm our hypothesis. And also having on board someone with Noah Planaski, he seems to be quite comfortable with these ideas, which I guess gave to me some more confidence too. Then as I said, I don't know the literature well enough to say more about that, to be honest. But what I've seen, what I've read, seems to be consistent with our overall idea.
Okay, thank you. I mean, one possible way to increase phosphate availability is by losing ferruginous conditions in the deep ocean, right? And so lesser absorption of phosphate onto iron oxide particles might lead to an increase in availability. That occurs around the time that you need it to.
Okay,
thanks.
So thank you.
Oded, see you raising your hand.
Andrea, thanks a lot. Very interesting seminar and very intriguing ideas. What I want to ask is, you have quite a variability in diamond carbon composition, carbon composition of diamonds, in clogitic ones, and they appear to be older creatures than most of your kimberlites. And from the work that we are doing here, it seems that diamonds grow from carbonatitic melts, which are not far from kimberlites, or at least from the proto-kimberlites, before you contaminate them with mantle and crustal material. So the so do the would your theory also apply to the formation of this in very old times? I mean, the ages are I mean, from 1 to 2.5 billion years. So you have them to explain as well.
Yep. Yeah. And that is.
And then after you answer that, I have also a suggestion about this thing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's totally the case, and I totally agree. Indeed, I mean, I don't want to give the wrong impression that I'm claiming there is no deep cycling of organic carbon before the Phanerozoic. I mean, that would be obviously absolutely foolish and actually incorrect, both based on the data for diamonds, but also based on where are they? Also on these data. Okay. So what I think is changing is the scale to which organic carbon is actually recycled back in deep in the earth. Here we are looking at a signal that becomes essentially common at least in kimberlites, whereas here we are looking at the oddball. And diamonds, yeah, they of course they tell us that there has been some carbon subducted, some organic carbon subducted way before the Phanerozoic.
And now, wouldn't that disturb your primordial source from which you want to form kimberlites? If you add material from subduction into the earth over a long history, as shown by the diamonds. And this is one thing. And the other is, recently, people are dating, or at least get the isotopic composition of single inclusions in diamonds. And I suggest that you can try to put this new data on your plots and see where the diamond data fall in respect to the kimberlite data, because you have strontium and neodymium and you have the carbon from the diamond. So altogether, you can put these things into your plots.
I think the story with diamonds is perhaps even more complicated than the story with kimberlites, if possible. Because, yeah, it's right. Some of the diamonds have fluid inclusions of compositions that are similar to kimberlites, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those diamonds crystallize from the kimberlites. And also the diamonds, most of the diamonds being lithospheric, they have a signature. So they have also a contribution from the lithospheric mantle that is much more significant than kimberlites. The little work that has been done that I've seen published, then I guess you guys are working actively on that. From Klein Ben David, for example, I think maybe you were involved in those papers too, is that you have huge variability in the isotopic compositions of those inclusions. And that's, reflects the fact that you have interaction between your diamond forming fluids and some indigenous enriched components in the lithospheric mantle. The other problems of using single inclusions ages is that the uncertainties associated with these ages are 300, 400, 500 million years. So I'm not sure that they would be ideal if we want to, track small temporal variations, or if we try to resolve temporal variations. I'm not saying that that's not great work. It is. It's just that I think we're looking at things from a different scale and a different perspective, both temporal and spatial.
More questions, Jakob? You have? Yes.
I have tons of questions, Andrea, but I want to expand a little bit on Oded's question. But ask it for the kimberlites data that you showed. Basically, you argued, I think nicely, for an old source that was isolated for a long time for the kimberlites in the convective mantle. Through history. And this includes also the young kimberlites. If I remember correctly, according to the neodymium isotopic composition and some other data that you showed.
Can I clarify that's the idea, that the hypothesis that was put forward in the paper in Nature in 2019, which I think I then essentially disproved in the following paper in 2021 in IES, even though I was a co-author in the one in Nature. So essentially what I showed is that we have a common component, but we're not looking at the source that is isolated. And indeed, sorry, I forgot to reply about to a related question by Oded on that. So I just want to, I am not convinced at all that this source was, impermeable to mantle convection through the age of the Earth. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so I guess I missed that, but basically your young kimberlites here, they show, according to what you say, a contribution from young subduction compared to older kimberlites.
Yeah.
So how this goes together with the data that shows something like a source that is isolated, although now you say that it was probably not isolated completely. And the second thing is that if I remember correctly, I think that the average of gloss of global subducted sediment is still -5. And this relates also to the young kimberlite data that you show here, and maybe to older diamonds, like what is unique about those that drive their carbon isotopic composition to a lower value if you agree with the gloss average of -5.
So the problem with gloss is that it refers to present day sediments, whereas whatever was subducted earlier in the Phanerozoic was quite different. There was not so much limestone material simply because the calcifiers, the plantic calcifiers were not there yet. And so we are looking at a different isotopic compositions on that side. Then I should go back to the details of the model, but then essentially the compositions that I took show that there was quite a decoupling between oxidized carbon and reduced carbon. I can't remember now exactly which were the relative ratio, but regardless, the key point is that if you look at what's happening today in subduction zones, most of the oxidized carbon is just being released by volcanic, by arc processing. Okay, so if you look then at experiments done on subducting material, that's the same story. You have quite an impermeable barrier for oxidized carbon to go deep in the earth. And finally, the one that managed to go through, say, in altered oceanic crust is anyway released up to mantle transition zone depths or thereabouts, based on, say, the experiment of Mike Walker and the like. So you have a really hard time for any oxidized carbon, even though there was lesser oxidized carbon at the beginning of the Phanerozoic than today. Even today, you have a hard time to transport it deep down. And I mean, diamonds simply confirm that, because you don't have heavy carbon in diamonds generally. Conversely, reduced carbon is relatively insoluble in subduction zone fluids, compared to oxidized carbon. Of course, it is also soluble. You're going to lose anywhere between 10 and 90% of reduced carbon as well during subduction. And I guess that probably address your second question. Regarding your first question of how can such a ancient signature be preserved despite all this messing up by deeply subducted or delaminated, say, recycled material, I think this very old component is quite fusible. And we're not really looking at the source that isolated. We are looking at maybe little blobs of these ancient components that are systematically part of the kimberlite source. I don't want to go too farther, but we are now looking at global compilations of Cenozoic mafic magmas And we are systematically finding the prima component essentially everywhere. So it's not just a kimberlite story. For the moment it is, but I guess if you wait another 6 months or 1 year, you will see that it's not just a kimberlite story. And also there, that this prima component, it's highly fusible. We see that as actually the most fusible components, and we see that mixed with recycled component, which is a little bit as what we see in kimberlites. But hold on a little bit longer.
Thank you.
All right. I think that we are out of time. So I'd like to thank you again, Andrea, for really, I think that also the discussion was super interesting and a great talk. And yeah, next seminar will be next week. So stay tuned.